Well, welcome to the Merrimack, everyone. I think most of you, are you all local? You are, okay. So everyone's pretty familiar with the Merrimack, right? Anybody know what the name of the Merrimack is in the language that the people spoke? That's a trick question, right? You're very close, yes. It's of course been transliterated in different ways, but the great Sagamore Kankamagas, who many of you know from his highway that was named after him in the White Mountains, he called it the Malamake in documents that he wrote himself. He was most likely literate, and he actually penned documents between the colonial government of New Hampshire and Massachusetts and his tribe. And there's another transliteration, Molodamak, and that comes from the scholar, the Abenaki scholar, Lisa Brooks, who has written some incredible books I would highly recommend. One is called The Common Pot, and the title is the idea of reciprocity that we were talking about earlier, which is fundamental to all Native cultures, where there's always a give and take and a sharing. And that really was the basis of many of the early interactions with the Native peoples of this area and the colonists who came, was this idea of sharing in the common pot of resources. And so she wrote that book. She also wrote a book which won the Bancroft Prize called Our Beloved Kin. And that is about King Philip's War, or Metacomet's resistance, which was a resistance movement of the Native peoples who finally got fed up with all the dispossession and shenanigans for many decades and stood up against the colonists. It was actually the bloodiest war, still is, per capita on our soil, even more than the Civil War. Many people don't know that. About a quarter of the English population was killed in this conflict, and probably more than that of Native peoples. And so Lisa Brooks wrote a fabulous book called Our Beloved Kin. I would highly recommend that. So in the words of Kankamagas, he describes this as one river, great many names, talking about the Merrimack River and the Wallanock River Valley communities and the interconnected kin groups. And I have a little picture here, a map. It was done by another local historian, Mary Ellen LaBianca. Maybe I can take it out and pass it around for people to be able to see it better. And it shows all the different names of the communities that were all up and down the Merrimack River. The source of the Merrimack was not known, believe it or not, until the mid-17th century, even by the colonists. They did not know where the Merrimack was, even though on their patent, on their charter for Massachusetts Bay Colony, it was the line that demarcated the border. And in the title of this talk, I think it talks about the frontier and the Merrimack as the borderland. So 3 miles north of this river was no longer Massachusetts Bay Colony. And beyond that, the great Sagamore Passaconaway, who we're going to talk about in a little while, really had his dominion and domain. So I also wanted to come here because I wanted to talk about contemporary Native people. And this sculpture is made by a local sculptor, Joseph Gray, who is part Abenaki. And he has absolutely gorgeous work. Much of it can be seen along the boardwalk here. He has a seal and some other pieces. This one is called Dance Me to the End of Time. So I wanted to make sure that we are aware that Abenaki peoples are still with us today. Contemporary peoples are still making cultural contributions in our communities. And we also know about people that lived in this area for over 10,000 years. One of the earliest sites, which is not directly on the river but not far, is Bull Brook. Has anyone heard of that? It's in Ipswich, and it was one of the very earliest Paleo-Indian sites. And I have also a handout here that you can look at. And we know about the points that were found there. These are fluted points, which are associated with a very early period. We also know that just across the river here, another of the oldest sites that's been documented is Morrill Point. And there were burials found there, including tools and objects with red ochre. And so this tells us that it's from at least the Archaic period, if not the Paleo period, about 8,000 years ago. So we know that people have been here for a very long time. The land that we are actually standing on right now is fill. So the Merrimack River actually used to be much closer to the Custom House Maritime Museum up to the back door, and over time it was filled in. So in the 1970s there was an excavation done all along the boardwalk when they were doing the urban renewal project. Unfortunately, a lot of what was excavated was backfill. It was not the original context. So despite that, we do have some evidence that came in the form of some tools that were found here from, again, the archaic period between 1500 BC and 5200 BC. So the excavation that was done found that. It also found in the basement of what is today the Daily News building. They found an actual shell midden. And shell heaps are one of the first things that archaeologists found and identified, that they realized that native people had been here for thousands and thousands of years. They would, of course, use all of the marine mammals here for food and sustenance, and after they were done, they would throw their shells in a heap. And these became these clam middens. Some of you know of Damariscotta has very famous shell middens that are huge. I mean, they're like several meters high and many, many meters long. Unfortunately, a lot of those were destroyed and taken for fertilizer. They were used by white people later on for fertilizer. We also have evidence of village sites all up and down the Merrimack River. There was an archaeologist, Warren Moorhead, who in the 20s and 30s worked for the Peabody Museum in Andover, and he and his crew excavated and did surveys of village sites all up and down the Merrimack. He found 26 village sites between Tingsboro and Newburyport here alone, and I think he found, 40 and 26 sites between here and Ipswich alone. And this was just very surface excavation. So he does have a map, which I'll pass around. I think I'm passing it around already. And we also know of a site in Andover called Shattuck Farm, right along the banks of the Merrimack. And you can pass that around. This is what a typical Algonquin Abenaki village would have looked like. The Algonquin peoples came here about 2,500 years ago, Algonquin speaking peoples, that's the overarching language group. And then the people who spoke Abenaki, a western dialect of Abenaki, came here approximately 1,500 years ago into our area. We also know that corn, maize came in around the same period of time. I'm going to pass around one more image here. This was something found in the late 1700s by Jonathan Titcomb, who was actually one of the officers of the Custom House at the time. He even met George Washington. And he found this really beautifully done wolf pipe right here in Newburyport in one of the excavations. Of course, we know that boats were essential to navigating on a river like the Merrimack. It was a very treacherous river. We're not 100% sure whether machoons or birch bark canoes or both were used. Machoons were a dugout canoe, and I think I might have passed around an image already of that. Maybe not. Oh, here it is. And they were done with fire as well as hollowing out of the canoes by hand with axes. And they could carry many, many people. We have accounts actually of Roger Williams, who many people know as the founder of Rhode Island. Before that, he was the minister of Salem, Mass. But he was kicked out. He was excommunicated by John Winthrop and the first settlers of Massachusetts Bay Colony because he believed that Native peoples had a right to their land. Wow, what a concept, huh? Well, that was a blasphemy in those times, and he got into major theological arguments with John Winthrop and others, and he was excommunicated and his writings were burned. And then he went to to Rhode Island, excuse me. But what he said was about the canoes, he wrote a book called The Key to the Language in the Americas, which is an excellent book for understanding native languages. Some of them will not well carry above 3 or 4, but some of them 20, 30, or 40 men. So that's how big some of these machoons could be that would carry people on a river like the Merrimack. They fished, of course, for many species here. The alewives are herrings, which still run today but have been endangered because of dams and other environmental factors. Today there are groups working to remove dams on some of the rivers where the herring come in and spawn. There's also salmon here, there was bass, and the sturgeon. Sturgeon were huge fish. They could be 12 feet long, some more. This is actually one of the only areas that sturgeon still survive right here in the Merrimack, and they're now protected. They've been endangered, but they are still living and they're able to survive today. And they would fish at night with torches. They would have torches that would attract the sturgeon to the surface. They were able to spear them, and they would also take their eggs and caviar, which were highly prized. Fishing, of course, was a main source of sustenance for the native peoples, as it would be for the colonists. You may have heard of the sacred cod in the State House today. That was because cod fishery was so important off the Grand Banks and all the way up and down the coast of the Merrimack here. Of course, this river became the source of both trade and exchange, not only between tribes and groups, but between the settler colonists and the native peoples. It also became a source of contestation and dispute, whereas the border of their charter pretty much extended to just 3 miles beyond here. This was an area where there was much autonomy and sovereignty north of the river for many decades after the settlement. We know of the earliest interactions between Pawtucket, who were the bands that lived along the Merrimack, and fishermen and traders from 1602. As early as 1602, Bartholomew Gosnold, originally from the Virginia Company, sailed up to the area of Nahant, Lynn today, and encountered a native man wearing a full suit of English clothes. This is in 1602, mind you. So we know that there was trade and interaction happening long before the Mayflower or the Arbella came. And he was wearing this suit of English clothes. His name was Poquonum. He was a Sagamore, which is a male patrilineal leader of his community. And we know that he traded and allowed the colonists to settle in exchange for tribute. This is a very important concept. Many people think that the natives were just dupes. They sold their land for a few trinkets of beads. They didn't know what they were doing. What they believed was that they were still in charge of the land and of the territory. And when the settlers came, they welcomed them with this idea of the common pod and reciprocity, as long as they weren't kidnapping them or, doing violence right off the bat towards them. But they expected something in exchange, and often that was tribute. So the idea of taxes that we would pay to a leader today, to a government, they said, we are the ones in charge here. Yes, you can come and live here. You pay tribute to me. You give me X amount of yards of cloth. You give me X amount of wampum or metal pots or knives or guns or whatever it is you have that we want. We will give you furs. We will allow you to come and farm next to us here collectively. And this happened in many cases. We also know, as I mentioned earlier, that the earliest traders and navigators saw beautifully cultivated farm fields all along the coast, and they know that they had already cultivated these lands. So it's a myth that they were just a wild, untamed wilderness when the people came. We talked a little bit about the disease, the Great Dying. During this period, we know that these wars, these intertribal wars, were also happening. I mentioned people coming down the coast and raiding. The Micmac, Passamaquoddy, other northern groups who could not grow corn, who were also involved with the French fur trade, annually would come down here. So the people here did have conflict within their tribal societies, and this actually resulted in 1619 in the death of the great Sagamore Nanepeshemet. Nanepeshemet had brought together the Massachusetts Alliance, which at that time was the most powerful union of groups in the area. With his death, he lived in Medford. He had a fort, and the Tarentines, so-called, came down. And when he was killed, his wife, the Sun Squaw of Missatec, Squaw Sachem, who we spoke about earlier with the statue inside, she became the leader of the group. Her 3 sons had not quite come of age yet, so while they were still young, she became the leader. As her sons came of age, they also became leaders in their own right of all the areas from Salem, Namkeg, to this area and north. At the time of Squaw Sachem's ascendancy to being a Sagamore, there was also Passaconaway in the north. And one of the ways that leadership families, just like the white English leadership families, would consolidate their power was to intermarry. So you had leadership families marrying with each other. So Squaw Sachem's sons married Passaconaway's daughters in the north, and he was the Sagamore of the Pennacook. And she and her sons were part of the Pawtucket. And so the Pawtucket and Pennacook formed an alliance, and this became a powerful political force that continued for many decades. Also at the time, Squaw Sachem was living in the area of Namkeg, which is Salem-Beverly area. And she welcomed Endicott, John Endicott, who came here even before John Winthrop in 1630, and also invited them to share the land and resources with them. So for a number of years, there was a certain amount of reciprocity and welcoming on the part of the native peoples and sharing of the common pot before things started to go downhill. And pressures from the Great Migration, which we'll talk about in a bit, started to put more and more pressure on lands. Good question. Yes, we actually know that she remarried a man who was the family physician. I'm not sure if I'm saying it right, but Webequat. And he was in the Concord, Mass area. And so when she married Webequat, and she lived part of the time in that area, and she also sold lands. There's a deed that was transacted, one of the earliest in the area. So yes, her territory was quite large. And I said earlier she was Pawtucket. I should also clarify that she was a Massachusetts Sachem, but her intermarriage with her former husband, Nanepeshemet, also made her partly a Pawtucket of the bands that were closer to the north. I should also mention, and I didn't, that Pawtucket refers to a falls, which is in the Lowell area. So if you follow the river up, where it bends around Lowell, Chelmsford, this was a traditional site of the Pawtucket where they had their winter and main village site. It was called Wamasett. Eventually it became a praying town that John Eliot converted many of the natives, but before that it was a traditional site, and at Pawtucket Falls annually they would gather. So when you hear Pawtucket, the word really refers to the different bands and villages that were all up and down the river. But Pawtucket Falls was one of their main sites for fishing. They would gather together. So to answer your question, yes, Squaw Sachem had a large territory that went all the way from Salem and even a little further north to Pawtucket and down to the Concord area and all the way down to north of the Mystic River. And her son, Wanahakwahan, who was Sagamore George, was the other, his English name. He also was known as the Sagamore of the Mystic River. And James, who was Manapatame, he was further north in the Saugus Lynn area. And then her other son, Weopikanin, he was Sagamore George, and he had the territory up closer to our area and into Salem after his two brothers also unfortunately succumbed to the smallpox plague. So so many place names that we have, and we don't even think about. Castle Hill, for instance, where the trustees of the reservation property is. That's where Sagamore Masconomet had his fort and diplomatic dealings. And so whenever you see like castle anything in a name, it often refers to what was once a native fortification. So yeah, pay attention to names, and if they sound native, that most likely they were. It's also important to remember that the names of groups were not really truly the names of groups, they were place names. So Agawam, for instance, which we're going to talk about more, or Pawtucket, these were not really the names of people, but the names of places. And that helped to denote the resources and the environments that they had. So. The word powwow comes from Pawa. And Pawa was a spiritual leader, and we might call them a medicine man. And I mentioned earlier Passaconaway. And Passaconaway, who lived in the north in the area between Concord and Manchester, which is today Litchfield. Natticook was his farmlands and main village site. And Concord, today what's Concord, was called Pennacook. That was the seat of power of the Pennacook Confederacy. That was one of the most powerful groups. They survived better the plague of 1616 to 1619 because of their geography, being further inland and away from the plagues which came down mostly through the coast and the trade routes by ship. He was able to, and many of the Pennacook were able to survive better. So he became noted as a great Pawa. And I'm going to pass around this image here, and it shows what Passaconaway may have looked like. Of course, it's a colonial depiction. On the right-hand side, we see him in a kind of a pointed hat, which looks like it may have been a gourd, and he has a bear draped on his clothing. And the bear is significant because his name was Child of the Bear, Passaconaway. So he had his insignia there in the depiction of him. And we also see on the left-hand side what a typical Abenaki couple would have looked like, which is surprising to many people, with these pointed, peaked hats with very fine embroidery. Some of that influence may have come from the French in the north, but they incorporated it into their traditional clothing. I mentioned earlier the significance of Passaconaway's daughter marrying Squaw Sachem and Nanepeshemet's son, James, who was a Monopotame, and this marriage helped to unify the Pawtucket and Pennacook alliance. John Greenleaf Whittier, many of you know, the fireside poet of the 19th century, wrote a famous poem called The Bridal of Pennacook. Of course, this was a romanticized version of events, and he got the name wrong. He called her Weetamoo. Her name was Wenahu. Oops, yep. But I'm just going to read a line from the poem. A story of the marriage of the chief of Saugus to the dusky Weetamoo, daughter of Passaconaway, who dwelt in the old time upon the Merrimack. For the Saugus Sachem had come to woo the Bashaba's daughter, Weetamoo, and laid at her feet that night his softest furs and wampum white. From the Crystal Hills to the far southeast, the river Sagamores come to the feast, and chiefs whose homes the sea winds shook sat down on the mats of Pennacook. So we see there a lot, actually, that's in just those couple of lines about it being the Saugus Sachem, which James was at the time, and the daughter of Passaconaway, and the importance of this river and of the sea, but connecting with the areas further north. We also know that in 1629, Passaconaway supposedly signed one of the earliest deeds in the area of the Piscataqua. You may know the Piscataqua River in the Exeter area. Now, there's some controversy about this deed. It was called the Wheelwright Deed of 1629. And it's believed that the Reverend Wheelwright, who supposedly signed this document, was not even in the colonies yet at the time. So most likely that part of the document was fraudulent. However, it is believed by researchers that the mark of Passaconaway and his tributary Sagamores is legitimate, and that they actually did sign this document. What's significant about this document, and I have a copy here that I will pass around with, you can see the mark of Passaconaway on the upper right-hand side there. What is significant is that Passaconaway preserved usufruct rights, which were the rights to ongoing hunting, fishing, and occupation. And furthermore, as we discussed, when Sagamores signed these deeds, many of them still believed that they were the proprietors of the territory, and they expected the English to pay them an annual tribute. So Passaconaway in this deed required so many yards of cloth and so much corn and so much trade goods annually. So being an annual agreement, you can see that he was thinking that, okay, you're here, we're welcoming you, you're going to be our ally, our trading partner, you will pay us like a lease and a rent and a tribute every year. So this was 1629. There was another deed signed 10 years later by Passaconaway's other Sagamores, which we do believe was legitimately signed by Wheelwright and the others. In 1623, we know that Passaconaway was already dealing with Christopher Levitt, who came into the Ordeorn Point area, just north of there, was one of the earliest settlements in New Hampshire, 1623. So this is long before the Arbella even came in. He was already dealing with the settlers at that time up there. He was also known, as I said, as the Pawa. In colonial thought, this was kind of the devil, you know, and these were savages and these were barbaric practices that he had. So the Reverend Hubbard of Ipswich called him a great sorcerer, and his fame was widely spread. It was said of him he could cause a green leaf to grow in the winter. He was undoubtedly one of those shrewd and powerful men whose achievements are always regarded by a barbarous people as the result of supernatural aid. The Indians gave to such the name of Pawas or Panasees. William Wood, who had a more favorable opinion of Native people, he was writing in the 1630s for Winthrop when he came over, and he was kind of a propagandist, so he was encouraging all the settlers, you've got to come here, it's a great place. He would talk about Passaconaway in more favorable terms, and he said he could hold his breath and dive under the Merrimack and then emerge all the way on the other side. And he also could make the water burn, the rocks move, the trees to dance, metamorphosize himself into a flaming man. He will do more, for in the winter, when there are no green leaves to be got, he will burn an old one to ashes and put those in the water, make a new green leaf, which you shall not only see, but substantially carry and handle, and make of a dead snake's skin a living snake, both to be seen, felt, and heard. So he had quite a reputation. And he did make very large efforts to continue a reciprocal relationship with the colonists all through his lifetime. And his son, Wanalancet, who took over the Sagamore ship in the 1660s when he passed away, did likewise, including during the period of King Philip's War, which I alluded to earliest as the bloodiest war. The Pennacook and the Pawtucket tried to remain neutral and tried not to engage. They even, in some cases, served as scouts and spies for the English, often under duress, but they did so. Sadly, this resulted in, at the end of the war, them still being accused of supporting Metacomet's resistance. And in Cochico, we have some people from Dover today. Cochico is the native name for Dover. Richard Waldron, who was a crooked trader, rounded up all of the Pawtucket and Pennacook. He was inviting them to a feast of celebration and of truce, or at least that's what the native people thought. And he rounded up 200 men, women, and children, and he sold many of them into foreign slavery. Some of them were brought to Boston Common where they were executed. Others were made slaves or servants in English people's homes. So this was the thanks that they got for their neutrality during the war. One of the people who was taken and sold into slavery was Winnepeekoween, Sagamore George, Squaw Sachem and Nenepeshamit's youngest son, who was sold into Caribbean slavery. Miraculously, he was liberated, found, and brought back, and he lived his last days in the praying town of Natick, where he was cared for by his kin. But he was old at that period, and he had spent decades trying to fight for land and rights that his people were denied. So it's a sad ending to that story, but that's the story of Passaconaway. And he continued to visit Powwow Hill, as we saw in the distance there in Amesbury. Annually, he would come down. Mount Agameticus is another place in Maine here that he often came. And so he would make the rounds. His territory was quite wide and vast. One interesting thing is that some of the earliest settlers, before Winthrop and the Massachusetts Bay Colony was established, had established one-on-one relations with the natives that were amicable and that were reciprocal. When the Massachusetts Bay Colony came in, there were a lot of land disputes, even between the settlers. And oftentimes at that point, the ones that had traded and lived peaceably with the natives were actually kicked out and told that your former agreements didn't matter. Now in 1644, I'm passing around a document here to show one of the earliest treaties of alliance that was made between Massachusetts Bay Colony and native peoples, and that was signed by Passaconaway, one of his sons, Squaw Sachem, and the Sagamore of Agawam, Masconomet, who we're going to talk about next. And the native people most likely thought of this as a way to maintain an ongoing alliance. It's called the Covenant. Some people call it a covenant or a submission to Massachusetts Bay. They agreed to either stay neutral or support the English in any wars that came up, and they may have agreed to also continue a trade relationship. It's debatable whether that was ever honored on the part of the English. For a short period of time, perhaps it was. The native people gave 5,200 beads of wampum, and in exchange they got some cloth and a jug of wine, and they were made to convert to Christianity after that point. Sagamore Masconomet is thought to be the first Sagamore to convert to Christianity. If you read his deposition, the answers are quite interesting. I'm not sure if I agree that he converted fully. I think he had his own idea of what he was answering and how he was subverting those questions. For a certain period of time, perhaps that maintained a peace, and the Pennacook and Pawtucket were able to remain kind of neutral. But very shortly, as land disputes and resources became scarcer and scarcer, that changed. One of the turning points in the colonial relations was in the 1630s, 1637 of the Pequot War. John Eliot is complicated. He was, of course, his goal was to Christianize and to assimilate the native people, along with Daniel Gookin, the first Indian superintendent of Massachusetts Bay. What's interesting about John Eliot, I'm going to pass this around too. Some of you may know about the Eliot Bible. It was actually the first Bible ever printed in Massachusetts Bay Colony. It was printed in the Algonquin, Massachusetts language. And Eliot did this specifically to be able to communicate with and convert the native people. And he established what were called praying towns. The one for the Wamasett, Pawtucket Falls area was in what's today Lowell, Chelmsford area. And it wasn't established until the 1660s. It was one of the last to be established, in part because the power of Passaconaway to maintain his autonomy and sovereignty maintained that until that period of time. So in the north, the groups did have a little bit more autonomy than the groups, some of them further south in Massachusetts Bay. Masconomet was the Sagamore of Agawam. Agawam is what's today Ipswich. And in 1630, when the Arbella first came in with John Winthrop, the first people to greet him were the Pawtucket. And Salem Beverly Harbor is the area where we believe that Winthrop was lost. His ship was probably blown off course. He didn't know where he was. So the people at that time may have had an opportunity to divert him or to even, possibly, fire against him, but didn't. Instead, they paddled out. So in Winthrop's journal, we see an account of the Sagamore of Masconomet spending the whole day aboard the Arbella with Winthrop and his entourage. It would have been interesting to be a fly on the wall to hear what they were talking about. He was probably encouraged by the fact that his kin in Nomkeg had already been dealing with Endicott and some of the earlier settlers from the Dorchester Company, which had arrived in the 1620s, and did have some reciprocal relations. The native people allowed the settlers to come and plant next to them for trade. Now, another aspect of this, which we didn't talk about too much, is that the English were also seen as a possible ally for protection against the intertribal warfare that was happening. So in the beginning, they welcomed them as trading partners and also as a potential buffer from what was happening. Now, this becomes significant in 1631 when a group comes to attack Masconomet's village in Agawam. And they come in and they wound Masconomet and also Squaw Sachem's sons, Monopotame and Wonahaquahan, and also kidnap the wife of James, Winahoo, and take her. And there was actually a fishing captain from Pemaquid that helped ransom her and get her back. And that's in the poem of Whittier's as well. So at that point, Winthrop Jr., who was Winthrop, the governor's son, was allowed to charter Ipswich in 1632. And Masconomet was blamed for inciting this attack, and he was banned from English houses for a period of a year. However, he did come back into relations with the English. He was able to stay in the area, and when Ipswich was founded, there was no deed originally. They just settled, there was given a charter. Massachusetts Bay would just issue a charter. They said that you had to buy your title rights, but the land was always given from the sovereign. and that's how it was. The Massachusetts New England company said that they should buy their title rights lest we avoid any scruple of intrusion, was the quote. And so they did make certain effort to buy title rights, but this was of course a Western concept of land ownership and exchange. But Masconomet ends up signing the first deed in Agawam, and I have a copy of that to show you, in 1637 and 1638 respectively. This is a depiction, a 19th century depiction of Masconomet, probably not particularly accurate. However, he does have one element which is notable, and that's the bear claw necklace. And named for the black bear is the name of Masconomet. Masconomet was also had another name, Quanawapakat. I'm not sure I'm saying that correctly, but that was his given name, and then he became the Sagamore Masconomet. And so in 1637, he deeds to John Winthrop Jr. first his own lands, agricultural lands around Chabaco and Argilla Farm, and then afterwards deeds the entire territory, which is known as Agawam. Even though Agawam was most likely just a small village, it was used to denote a much larger area, which is today Essex County. So if you look on the map of Essex County, basically that whole area was sold for 20 pounds to Winthrop Jr. and the settlers. Now this deed was different from Passaconaway's. This is an important point, because at this point we see a shift in the language. And this time it was not preserving hunting and fishing rights. He gives up all of the rights to all of those things. Every river, every stream, everything he gives up the rights to. However, he is still allowed to live in the area. And in 1644 he does sign that covenant along with Passaconaway. He is given, this is interesting, Newbury, which was founded in 1635. In 1644 he's given, it's very ironic, a piece of land in Newbury. It's a lot that he's given. So he sells the whole of Essex County for 20 pounds and they give him a little lot. Nice of them. In 1658 he is given a piece of land that was his, of course, and theirs on Sagamore Hill. It used to be called Winthrop Hill. Today it's in Hamilton, and you can go and visit the resting place of Masconomet. He sadly died the same year he was granted the land in 1658. He was buried there with his wife, supposedly buried with his gun and his tomahawk. He was one of the only Sagamores allowed to continue to bear arms, and did maintain relations with the colonial authorities in Ipswich. So you can visit today. It's a very sacred place, and it's run, it's operated in part by the Essex County Greenbelt, looking for the words, yeah, which is a great organization that preserves open space. So Essex County Greenbelt manages the land of the Donovan Reservation, and there are trails that lead to it. And it is a ceremonial site where people come and make traditional offerings, and you can pay your respects to Masconomet there and his wife. We don't know her name, sadly.
If they couldn't fish or hunt on the land, how did they survive? Did they travel off the land further west?
Good question. Yes, it became increasingly difficult. They had to adopt more, Western, English lifestyles. Oftentimes, sadly, they became indebted and indentured to English families. We have records in Newbury of indentured servants, slave, native people into the 1700s. So many of them, when they lost their ability to fish or hunt, had to serve English people and become indentured. So we see that with Great Tom in 1650. He sells what is one of the last remaining farmlands, which is a fenced field at Indian Hill in West Newbury, and after that he becomes indentured to the proprietors of that town. So they had little choice but to become servants or to move away to the north. Many of the people here decided to go north with Passaconaway because he still had a certain amount of autonomy further north in the area of Concord and Manchester and those areas. But it became increasingly difficult, of course, for them to make a living or to sustain themselves at all.
Because it just kept going.
It kept going and going, and they were pressured to leave or to adapt to more Western lifestyle. An interesting story also is that John Winthrop Jr. and his associates in the Ipswich area acquired slaves from the Pequot War. And I almost forgot to mention the Pequot War happened at the same time that Masconomet was selling his lands. So in 1637 and 8, when the deeds were signed, 1637 was the Pequot War. There were 9 men from Newbury that went to the Pequot so-called war, which really was a massacre where hundreds of women and children and men were slaughtered at the Pequot homeland in Connecticut. After that conflict, the survivors were basically enslaved, and many of them were sold to colonial officials. Roger Williams and Winthrop had a whole discussion about the, whether or not these people should be enslaved locally or sold abroad, or how they should be treated. And some of Winthrop's kin in Ipswich acquired some of them. There was also a man named Pekawamid. I'm sure I'm not saying that right, sorry. He was Ned, is his English name, and he became Winthrop's servant, and he hunted and fished for Winthrop. So the English didn't even do a lot of their own hunting at the time, right? They were the gentry. So he had this native man who guided him and also hunted for him. The other piece of the survival had to do with the fur trade. And I'm sorry I didn't mention that earlier. The fur trade was the primary source of exchange in this area between the English and the native people. So that was primary. When that started to, the population of the beaver actually started to become depleted from the great amount of hunting that was going on to ship furs back to England, this also created a cycle of indebtedness and indenture for the native people who used to be able to pay off their trade debts through the beaver pelts. When that became difficult, they had to sell more and more land. And we see that with Ned, who was Winthrop Jr.'s servant. He became indebted to different tavern keepers in Ipswich and others, and then he had to sell more and more lands in order to pay off debts. And even Passaconaway's son, who signed the 1644 covenant, you're asking me if they upheld their end of the bargain. In the 1650s, he was jailed over a debt that wasn't even his, but Sagamores were responsible to their people. So when their people became indebted, Passaconaway's son was held responsible and put in jail for a couple of years. They had to sell one of their most prized islands in the Merrimack, Weekasuck Island, which was their prized corn raising area, agricultural area, in order to bail out his son from jail. So Wanalancet, who was Passaconaway's son, had to help get his brother out of jail by selling another piece of land. So this is how gradually this dispossession was happening of the native peoples, and they were being forced either into praying towns, as servants or indentures to English families, or to move north, or areas that still had some level of autonomy where they could hunt and fish and have their traditional lifestyles. I wanted to show you also William Wood's map here. This is one of the maps where we know some of the earliest names of village sites around here, including Quassaquequan, which was the area for Newbury, today Newburyport. Quassaquequan was most likely a village site that was on Old Town Hill. Some of you probably know Old Town Hill. It's a beautiful place to walk. There's a confluence of rivers there, the Parker River and the Little River, and where those two meet, which was often the case in watersheds where people would have their village sites and have a southwest facing slope so that they could grow corn on the hills. And we believe that Quassaquequan was probably the area of Old Town Hill. And we also see on William Wood's map annotated Igawam, and that again refers to Agawam, which was Masconomet's territory. And it's been translated in contemporary times as the far side of the marsh, other side of the marsh, by historian Mary Ellen Lepianka and others. I don't know if anyone has ever seen this sign before. The Great What? What's this all about? Anybody know anything about the Great What? He was a fisherman. That's good. Of course, she probably knows a lot, so she's like, no, I'm not going to say anything. Anybody know anything else? The sign doesn't tell us much, does it? No. So this is talking about Watt's Cellar. Near this spot was Watt's Cellar, a landmark. Before the settlement of Newbury in 1635, time. An excavation used for the storage of fish. So it really doesn't tell us much, but this sign and the person's identity was actually unknown at the time that it was erected. You might recognize the style of the sign. It was put up during the tercentenary in the 1930s. A lot of these historic signs that look similar were put up. And we're going to unpack a little bit of the symbolism that's at the top of the sign afterwards. But at the time that it was erected, nobody knew who the Great Wat was. It wasn't until the 1970s where an archaeologist, using deeds and records of the wharfs, the named wharfs, and fishermen who had wharf rights here, and archaeology, and John Winthrop, the governor of Massachusetts Bay Colony's writings were put together, and she came up with the fact that the Great Wat was a man named Walter Bagnall. And Bagnall at the time, in 1625, was indentured to Thomas Morton. I don't know if you're familiar with Thomas Morton. He had a settlement called Merrymount in the Quincy area. And this was before New England Company and Massachusetts Bay Colony came. There was a charter in the 1620s, 1621, to Mason and Jorge's. It was called the Mariana Patent. And this gave rights of settlement from the area of Salem in Naumkeag to the Merrimack River, and then all the way up to the Kennebec River. Kennebec. This conflicted with the Massachusetts Bay Charter, which was chartered from the Charles River all the way up to 3 miles north of the Merrimack River. So this became a conflict between colonial powers. So when Morton had his settlement in Merrymount, he was looked upon with disdain by some of the other colonial powers, including Plymouth. And his settlement was decidedly un-Puritan. He was trading in guns and alcohol with the natives, and he also set up a maypole for some merriment. So he was definitely not in good favor with the Puritan powers that were. But there was an additional element, which was this land dispute between the colonial powers. So in 1626, Morton and Bagnall were in association together, trading with the natives there, but Bagnall left. And we believe that between 1626 and 1628, he came here to Newburyport and continued to trade, but on his own, with natives at the period. And Wat's cellar, we believe, is a cellar that might have been used originally by native people for the storage of fish, and also possibly habitation occasionally, or a place of storage mostly. And then it was taken by the English and used as their place for storage of fish and furs and other goods that were going to be sent back to England. So between 1626 and 1628, we believe that Bagnall had his cellar here. Now in 1628, Morton was arrested by Miles Standish of the Plymouth colony, and he was shipped back to England so that they could eliminate some of the competition basically for land. And I have to read you this quote because I love it. Morton says of Miles Standish, he calls him Captain Shrimp. And he says, "I have found the Massachusetts Indians more full of humanity than the Christians." So interesting perspective there. So in 1628, Morton goes back. Bagnall at the time was known as a crooked and wicked trader. And in 1631, as a matter of fact, the Sagamores Wanahakwahan and Monmouthpatome, who were Sagamore Squassacham and Nanapeshaman's sons, who were the Sagamore leaders, they went to Winthrop and said, "This Bagnall guy has been cheating us for years, and we have some furs that we traded with and we never got paid by him. So we know that this guy was a wicked trader." He started another trading post just up the coast on Richmond's Isle in Maine, off the coast of Portland. And in 1631, because of his wicked ways, the natives burned his trading post and he was killed. Now we have to go back for a minute to our story of Poquanam. We talked a little bit about Poquanam, the Sagamore of Nahant, who greeted in 1602 the English wearing a suit of clothes and speaking English. he continued to trade with the settlers, and he welcomed many settlers in exchange for tribute. This went on all the way until 1633, when he was seized and hung and accused of killing Bagnall, which we know did not happen. And Winthrop himself defended him and said of Bagnall that they have killed them, burnt the house over them, and carried away the guns and whatever else they liked. This Bagnall was a wicked fellow and had much wronged the Indians. So he admits that they had a right to kill Bagnall and burn his trading post, and he tried to at least exonerate the name of Poquanam, but he did nothing to bring his killers to justice. And so this act of vigilante injustice happened. And sadly, Poquanam, who had been so amicable with the settlers for many decades, was wrongly accused and killed of that crime, for a crime he did not commit, I should say. So it's kind of a sad story about Poquanam, but it brings us full circle in our talk here. And I want to talk for a minute about, before we go, about what we see in the insignia up top. I don't know if you're all familiar with the Massachusetts insignia there. This is our current state seal. Anybody know what's on it? I'm going to pass out some information, and please feel free to take one of those. The Massachusetts state seal has a big arm with a sword. That's Miles Standish's disembodied arm with a broadsword that was used by the English to decapitate native people and other enemies. Lovely, isn't it? And our motto, by the sword we seek peace and liberty. This is our current motto and seal that was put together in the late 1800s. The seal also depicts a derogatory image of a native person with a down-pointed arrow, which is a sign of submission. And also has a head of a native person from out west that's not even accurate to the headdress that would have been used out here. So this is our state seal, but it is being challenged now. And in 2021, Charlie Baker, the governor of Massachusetts, set up a commission, and it is now being changed. There was they just missed the deadline on coming up with a new design, but it's been extended, so they're still working on it. So there is a committee, and it includes contemporary Native people. And I want to pass around this to show you the Punkapog, Massachusetts band has a representative, Elizabeth Solomon, on the commission. And this is a group that had traditionally had their territory and later was turned into a praying town in the Boston area, Dorchester, but they are working right now. The other state seal that I passed around to you, which is the original state seal of Massachusetts, has another motto. I don't know if you can read it. What does it say? Come over and help us. Yep, so that's the first Massachusetts seal. So we have a history of...
should have been enslaving the white people. Come help us.
Right. Right. They got it. Yep.
Work our land for us.
Exactly.
Do it our way.
So we have an unfortunate history of representation of Native peoples in Massachusetts. We have quite a bit of erasure of Native history.
Well, not just
Thank you. Not just in Massachusetts, of course. I'm referring only because we're standing in Massachusetts, or what is today called Massachusetts. Of course, the name Massachusetts comes from a native name of a place that means on the Blue Hills, above the Blue Hills of Massachusetts. That's what Massachusetts means. So Massachusetts is a name also of a tribe that still exists today. That is their tribal insignia. And they are working to unerase the history that has been so long disregarded and twistery, as one of our native colleagues calls it, Roger Paul, who's an MIT Passamaquoddy linguist. He calls it the twistery. So we're trying to untwist the twistery that has been done. And I so appreciate everyone's time today. I don't know if anyone has any final questions or thoughts or additions.
books.
Yeah, lots of good. Oh, and there's another book that you should buy, and It's called Bursting and Lasting. Yeah, let me actually show you the cover because it's really significant. This is called Bursting and Lasting. So this is a very important concept about erasure that Gene O'Brien has written about, bursting and lasting. You know, we have these whole myth of the first settlers, right? And the last Indians. There's always the last of the Mohicans, the last Indian in this town, and the first settlers, first period houses. So this whole commentary about 19th century antiquarian historians and how they wrote Native peoples out of the history books and thought of them as a romantic, noble, savage idea that they were just vestiges of the past. This book is fabulous. It talks about the very specific history of the praying town of Natick, but of dispossession of Native peoples all across Massachusetts. And she's an excellent historian. And that is Poquantum. That is the Sagamore who had the suit of clothes and continued to trade and sadly was killed by hanging for a crime he never committed. So that concludes.
Quickly,
yeah.
Praying towns again.
Praying towns. This was John Eliot, the missionary, who translated the Bible into an Algonquin, a dialect, Massachusetts. He started these towns. Most of the praying towns were on former sites where there were actually native lands, and then they were turned into these. Really, they're kind of the country's first reservation system.
Okay.
Now, one more thing I'll say about them is when King Philip's War happened, all of the natives were required to live on these praying towns. They became like prison camps, or they had to be enslaved, or they could be killed, or they had to leave. Then many of the natives that were in these praying towns were rounded up, and they were put onto Deer Island in Boston Harbor in 1675, where half of them died in one winter. There was no food, clothing, or shelter. These were natives who had converted, who were supposedly allied with friendly, and they were just punished terribly, and then made to stay in these praying towns under pain of death. Yeah, so they became concentration camps essentially in the end. Yeah, at first there was a modicum of wanting to, they could preserve some of their culture in these praying towns and have a place where they knew their lands would not be taken, but it came at a great price, where they had to completely change their way of life, and then eventually they were basically imprisoned there. Yeah. So. Sorry, it's not a Cheerios. Thank you so much for your attention and for sticking around.
Thank you.
It was a long tour.
No, that was awesome.
Appreciate it. Thank you guys.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm happy to hang out and answer any more questions or whatever. But.